evening. I think everyone here is either Eastern time or Central time. It's Lindsay in our NCJW Washington office. So excited to have you all join in our January Tools for Transformation, Set Executive webinar call, or webinar. And we're so excited to have Nancy Litz, who's the Vice President of Advocacy in St. Louis, lead us in this really interesting conversation around best practices when writing a letter to the editor. So I am going to actually share my screen. I realize I haven't done that, and turn it over to Nancy to introduce herself and really get us started. So Nancy, maybe after you introduce yourself, I'll share the screen so people can still see each other.
Okay, that is just fine. Welcome. It's so nice to be working in this mode where I get to see people and really feel like I'm meeting all of you, I guess, for the first time in every case. As she said, I'm the VP of Advocacy for the St. Louis section, and I shared with the group earlier this morning that I have sort of an odd path into advocacy. I did not grow up Jewish. I encountered NCJW really for the first time when, at the urging of my young adult daughters, I was on a lobby day bus trip to Jefferson City. I had never lobbied the legislature before, and I was literally so terrified that when they divided us into groups to go and actually meet the legislators in their office, I tiptoed into the bathroom, and then after the groups were divvied up, I sneaked away, walked to the poor, pathetic downtown of our state capital, and shopped all afternoon. But I couldn't buy anything, of course, because I would then have to take it back on the bus and make it known that I was too chicken to go and talk to legislators. Fortunately, on the bus ride home, I happened to sit right across the aisle from the woman who was, at that time, the president-elect of the St. Louis section. We struck up a conversation. She invited me to a lunch and learn, told me that it was all right that I wasn't Jewish, and the rest is history. I'm now halfway through my second term as VP of Advocacy, and no longer sneak away when we go to the Capitol. So, sort of my personality when it comes to advocacy is to be what I used to call an S blank 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 disturber. I'm sure that in the current moment you can fill in the blank 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 pretty readily. Someone in NCJW told me that it was nicer to call that a bomb thrower. And that same person informed me that there were a lot of times in advocacy where it wasn't necessarily such an advantage to be a bomb thrower, that there was a lot to be said for what she called a termite, which means gnawing away at a problem a little bit at a time until you actually have a tremendous influence. And I think this whole idea of writing about our advocacy priorities for publication is really one of those termite activities. So let me spend just a couple of minutes on why it's worthwhile to spend the time and energy to write for publication, because an awful lot of people seem to make the assumption these days that nobody reads the newspaper anyway, so why bother? Interestingly, it seems that as sort of a backlash effect from all the current president's rhetoric about fake news, people are actually more committed to reading their local newspapers than they've been in quite a while. So, so there's more readership than you might imagine. And I'm going to pop to the next slide. The next one after that. That's termites. There we go. Thank you. That everybody who studies it seems to find that the most thoroughly read and widely read section of any newspaper is always the opinion section, the editorials that are written by the newspaper staff, the letters to the editor from readers, and then the op-ed pieces. Those are the either regular columns or submitted opinion pieces that run opposite the editorial page. So right there in the print newspaper, there's an awful lot of momentum to be generated from letters to the editor. But it goes beyond the people who read it, because virtually every newspaper today prints the same letters that they print in their actual physical edition, plus even more submissions that they didn't have room to print, are then displayed online on their website, which makes them, number one, very easy to share via social media, and also makes them searchable content. So if you're writing about a timely issue, there's a really good chance that people searching online for information about that issue could actually be directed to your letter as well. Another little wrinkle in all of this that I really wasn't aware of until recently is that anytime you mention the specific name of a lawmaker or an influencer that you want to reach by expressing your opinion, their clip service does nothing but go through all the relevant publications to clip virtually any mention of that lawmaker. So you're virtually guaranteed that your message will be seen. I don't know about you, but sometimes when I write a letter or send an email to a lawmaker, I wonder if they're ever going to see it or if it's just going to go off into the ozone. And with mentioning them in print, you're virtually guaranteed that they're going to see your message. Now, obviously, that's more of a guarantee when you're writing about local or statewide legislators. I'm sure that the president doesn't have time to read all the opinion pieces that are written about him, and it's probably just as well. The last item about why write that's covered on the slide is that the more letters a publication receives about an issue, whether they print all of them or not, the more that tells them that this is an issue that their readers are concerned about and interested in, and therefore the more thorough and the more in-depth their coverage of that issue is likely to be. Then when I really thought about it, I realized that our section has generated some benefits from encouraging our members to do more of this letter writing and opinion piece writing that aren't so much directed toward influencing public opinion, but rather toward creating more visibility for our section. So every time that there's a letter published where the byline is specifically designated as representing NCJW, that's just one more time that people hear about us, one more time that people who may not know us from other contexts start to understand the projects and the priorities that we work on. We found it a terrific way to find new allies to work with. One great example of that was a letter about the voter ID measure that our state legislature was promoting, through which we connected with a group that was part of the St. Louis Catholic Diocese. And normally, because of our differing stances on reproductive justice, that's not a group that we normally would find a lot of common ground with. But as it turns out, they were also doing some absolutely terrific work around voter ID and around helping people who needed those special IDs obtain them. And we found actually numerous ways that we could collaborate around that issue with a subgroup that we never would have been aware of had it not been for that letter to the editor. One other advantage of diving into writing letters to the editor is that it gives us an opportunity to engage some of our section members who, for reasons of age or disability or having small children or for whatever other encumbrance, are not in a position to join us at the state capitol or for a rally or for some of our other advocacy activities, but this is one they can do right from home. So it's great in that way as well. Do any of you have advantages about doing letters to the editor that I didn't mention that you want to share? I'm hearing crickets, so let's move on and talk about what kinds of publications you want to write for. And the critical decision about that is really thinking primarily in terms of who it is you want to influence and have the ability to influence. Of course, lots of people tell me they so want to have their letter published in the Washington Post or the New York Times, and so do I. But that's an awfully big pond. That's not to say that we shouldn't make those attempts, but I want to encourage you not to overlook the opportunities that are really right in your backyard. Most areas, in addition to the Metro Daily, which is a terrific resource for sure, but we often also have neighborhood papers by suburb or by a cluster of suburbs that get fewer letters, so they're more likely to be willing to publish a submission. And more important, they often are really, really critical components of the policies that govern our daily lives. One of my favorite examples of that is that PROMO, which is our Missouri state advocacy group for the LGBT community, has been working year after year after year for as long as I've been involved in advocacy to get our state legislature to pass a bill that would give them anti-discrimination protections. And it doesn't happen, and it doesn't happen, and it doesn't happen. And about 3 years ago, they decided, while they continued to work for that state level of proposals, that they started going instead to the various municipalities around our urban areas and convincing those municipalities to create those same kinds of non-discrimination policies. And now that's been so successful that approximately 80% of the population of the state of Missouri is covered by those non-discrimination policies, even though they haven't been successful with getting it enacted at the state level. So I think that's a really good indicator of how much we can influence policies of all sorts with opinion pieces that we write and submit in our neighborhood area. Metro papers are a pretty obvious opportunity. That's the one most people seem to think of. I do have a little tip about those sort of super papers, the Washington Post and the New York Times, for two examples. An easier way to get your message into the New York Times is through the comments on the letters that they publish from other readers. And if you pull up those letters and then you go to the comments section, you may notice that there are hundreds or even thousands of comments sometimes, but you'll also notice that there are much smaller groupings of comments that have been designated either editorial picks, that is, comments that were considered worthwhile enough by their editorial department to call them out specifically, and also reader favorites, the ones that more people have liked, and then those also are put in a special category where many more readers are likely to see them. I have no tips whatsoever about how to make your comment be an editor's pick, but those reader picks are determined based on likes. So when you're part of an organization like an NCJW section, if you coordinate with other section members to like your comment, you have the potential to bring it up and up and up in their listings and have your voice heard in a more a more full-throated way. It's also interesting to consider some of the opportunities for writing that aren't these newspaper kinds of things that we ordinarily think of. I'm sure you've noticed as much as I have that in today's climate, there's hardly a publication out there that isn't taking a more active look at writing about politics and public policy. To give you one extreme example, I just recently started receiving a complimentary and unsolicited monthly issue of Glamour magazine. Now, what would you think would be less political than Glamour magazine, for goodness sake? But I've been amazed at how much of their editorial content now is indeed focused on public policy issues. Another example that's a missed opportunity that I'm still kicking myself, but on a recent airline flight, their in-flight magazine had a really extensive article about an African-American woman who had been part of the second group that desegregated Central High in Little Rock, and talked about her then going on to college, to a master's degree, to a doctorate, and to then work in the nonprofit sector, and ultimately being recruited to come back to Little Rock to run the area's largest not-for-profit and become a huge voice in the community. It was a really inspiring story, but it was also an opportunity to write to that same publication, thank them for that inspiring story, and then remind them that it might be a little premature to be celebrating our great progress on the front of desegregating our schools, and share with them some of the not so optimistic statistics that were also in the news at that same time. So sort of just want to encourage you to expand your thinking about what opportunities for this kind of writing might be. And this seems like another good opportunity to open it up to the group. And if you want to take a second and unmute your speakers, if you'd like to share some thoughts of other publication ideas that that might be ones that we should add to our mental list here. Thoughts, anybody? No? Alrighty. Then
I just have a question.
Oh,
it's Jane
sure.
from Bergen County.
Uh-huh.
The Jewish papers in your community.
Oh, thank you. I have that on my notes on my handouts and totally skimmed right past it. But yes, that's an absolutely wonderful opportunity. What kinds of topics have you guys tackled in your Jewish paper?
You know, I don't remember any recently. We don't do a lot of the writing, but I was just curious what your thoughts were about even using those papers. Our local Jewish paper covers us a lot, but we don't tend to do a lot of writing to them. So,
well, we do fairly often, and we've had better luck getting larger op-ed pieces placed with them than we have with our regular city daily.
right.
And I think when it comes, in a way, I think that's similar to a neighborhood paper, that you have more influence with people that you have a direct connection with. One that's been in my mind for our Jewish paper is that we just they just ran an article about a young woman who was the development director for a Jewish not-for-profit in another city, and who was harassed sexually by the organization's largest donor, and did come forward with the story and was amazingly supported by her boss and the whole organization that she worked for. And I've given considerable thought to writing to the paper and saying that that was really inspiring and wonderful, and that please, we shouldn't assume that because that young woman had a positive experience in the way the Jewish community responded, that that was universally the case and that we didn't need to be any less aware and vigilant because one person
Had a sense.
came forward in a positive and had a positive result. So that would be one example, certainly, where it could be a fit. When you've used that as a resource, what topics have you guys covered?
As I honestly don't remember if we've sent editorials to them or not, but I was just curious about what your thinking was about even including the Jewish papers on your list.
Oh, I would think absolutely to include it. Another one that I added to my list, and we have not done this, and I'm not quite sure that I see exactly what our path might be, but we have a wonderful award-winning newspaper targeted specifically to our African American community. And I read it periodically, not as regularly as I probably should. But it occurs to me that there might be some opportunities there as well. So anything that gets us out of our silos in some way, I think, has a positive to it. So thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, I want to second that. The Jewish press is often, a source we look at, like even at a national level. As Nancy said, it's sometimes, hard to get into the New York Times and Washington Post. So we look at like the national Jewish news source. And something to add on, and this is like a whole other webinar, is developing relationships with some of the editors in your local press as well helps kind of get that letter to the editor in a little bit swifter, or an op-ed if you have a relationship with someone in the press, in the office.
One of the ways that we've worked toward that in St. Louis is that we do a monthly lunch and learn session, and in the months that are the run-up to any big election, we turn that into a pre-election series and invite our local journalists to be speakers. So that then we definitely get to be on a first name basis with them. And we also do an election debrief after every major election where we invite members of the press to be a panel, which has helped with that as well. Okay, I think we're ready to move on to our next slide. So just wanted to spend a minute or two on the differences between the two different formats of writing for publication. The first is letters to the editor, and I think that the name is completely self-explanatory. And those are generally the shorter kinds of content and considerably easier, I think, to actually get published. But the other thing to consider is what's called an op-ed, and that's short for the pieces that run opposite of the editorial page. So the editorial page is content that's actually written by the editorial staff of that particular publication, and the op-ed is sort of guest voices. That's generally longer content, a little bit more in-depth look at whatever the issue would be. And those kinds of submissions, even more than letters to the editor, are very heavily weighted based on the credentials or the connection to the topic of the person who's writing it. So that's one of the ways that we approach that, is to look for, when there's an issue that we want to write about in a more in-depth way, is to look for someone in our membership who has a direct, either personal or professional connection to that issue. To give you one example, we rather strongly suspect that one of these transgender bathroom bills will make its way back into our legislature during this session. And we happen to have a member who is a counseling professional, and her practice focuses specifically on transgender individuals. So I have her name and number on speed dial so that when that issue floats to the top, there's someone that I can work with to help her create content that then we could submit under either her name, the section's name, or her name and mine together, because she has such an obvious credential about that. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about op-ed content in this session, but in the handout materials, I did include 2 examples that have run in the last couple of months in our paper that I thought had some particularly interesting and relevant elements for us tonight. The first one is written by the woman who is the executive director of the Jewish low-income housing apartment complex in St. Louis, which is doing a massive, massive expansion, which is funded partly by private donations, but also partly by our state's low-income tax credit. And it was the availability of that tax credit that made the individual donors feel confident about the ability of the project to go forward and enable them to make their commitment. Now there's discussion of rescinding that low-income tax credit. So she wanted to write about the importance of their project and why people should support it. She spun off of the big news of the moment, which was all the hurricanes and massive storms. And her lead sentence was that there's a massive storm bearing down on St. Louis that you might not be aware of. And that was the storm of the fact that we are on the high end of baby boomers turning 65. So there's this buildup of people who are going to need that housing. And her closing line was, so watch for this tsunami of maturing population because it's headed our way, which I thought was just an absolutely terrific way of giving currency and immediacy to something that was otherwise a pretty dry issue. The other one was submitted by one of our collaborating organizations, a group called Women's Voices Raised for Social Justice. And the group had appointed a committee and spent a great deal of time putting together a position paper on racial justice. And they wanted to turn it into one of these op-ed pieces. But when they started writing, it started to sound really preachy, like, we believe this and we believe that and we believe whatever. And it wasn't very engaging. And then they decided to take the approach of talking about the process that they went through to develop a group consensus around this position paper. And so they took several of the different issues and talked about where there was initial disagreement about what the group's position should be. Black Lives Matter is a particularly obvious example. And how they researched it, what they found, how they weighed the issues and came to their conclusions. So without outwardly saying so, it says to the reader, yeah, we used to think this dumb thing too, but then when we really looked at it, here's what we found and here's the conclusions that we came to. We had to compromise among ourselves about our views. That's what working together is all about. We hope that you'll be able to do the same thing. So when you have time to look over those in detail, I think you'll find them both an interesting, enjoyable read, as well as instructive about some good ideas for how to construct that sort of a piece in the first place. Then let's move on and talk a little bit about what are the expectations when you're submitting a letter to the editor, and what are some little tricks in helping you get published. if you go to the website of virtually any publication and go to their opinion section, there'll be guidelines. So for instance, in our paper, it tells us how often will they publish any particular author's submission. And our particular newspaper has a rule that they'll only publish any individual's work every 60 days. The cool thing is, being part of an NCJW section, we have a whole team of people who can write op-eds, or I'm sorry, letters to the editor supporting our position. So if I write one this month or this week, and next week, or gosh, in the current climate, it could be day after tomorrow, some other big issue floats to the top, I can work with someone, or two of our members can pair up, or somebody can work individually and put together a letter on that new topic. And because it's a new name, we're not limited from being able to have that submitted for print as well. It's worth probably taking a second to talk about whether, when you submit a letter, you want it to go under your individual personal name, or under your name or the section president's name, but somehow designated as specifically the viewpoint of NCJW. And one of the factors that goes into that decision is that if you want to do it officially representing the section or the organization, there obviously then are some steps of approval that it needs to go through, and you'd need to talk with your section leadership at the highest levels about whether it's something they feel can be endorsed or approved at the section level, or something that needs national approval. So there are some nuances to that. Another thing that you'll find in that information on the web page is guidelines about how long your submissions should be. The interesting thing about that is, although they all seem to have those limits, they don't really seem to follow them very strictly. So for instance, our newspaper tells us that 250 words is their max, but I routinely see them publish things that are substantially longer than that, as much as 600 or 700 words. Now that doesn't mean that a short letter isn't also terrific, but if you have more to say, look and see how strictly they seem to be adhering to their own policy. Also, I found that if in your letter you're going to refer back to something else that publication has already printed, typically that would either be a news article or some other opinion piece, they want you to reference it very specifically by the headline or the title and the date that it was printed. And they really want that to be a very short turnaround time. So if you see an article today that you want to comment on, whether you're agreeing, contradicting, whatever, you'd probably like to have that in an email to them tomorrow. Contact information is another thing that they'll want, and they want not only your full name, and in our case, which of the St. Louis suburbs or the city you reside in, but they also want your phone number and your email address, not because they're going to publish that, thank goodness, but because they have a policy of contacting you before they print a letter that you submitted to, number one, be sure that you indeed submitted it, that it wasn't somebody else submitting it in your name, and number two, that you're still satisfied with what you wrote and willing to allow them to go forward and publish it. Unfortunately, not every single newspaper does that. So I have to admit that I really learned the hard way to be sure that the things that I said in a letter were things that I actually was going to be happy having in print. Maybe in some other context, I'll tell you my sad story of when I didn't do that. Once again, before we move on to our next slide, do any of you have
I have a
things that you
question.
found that your papers expect that the rest of us ought to know about?
Maddie, go for it.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So regarding contact info, so you said they won't always contact you to, ensure that you're still willing to publish your article. Does that mean that it's also not guaranteed that you'll be notified if you are published, or will they notify you if you get published?
I would think that in my experience, that communication is one and the same. They only reach back out to you if they're going to print it. So it would be both notification and to get your okay. I've also found that larger publications are more likely to reach back out to you with that information. But I think in the future going forward, if I was submitting something to a publication that I had not worked with in the past, I'd ask, I would reach out to them and ask first about their notification policy.
Okay.
And again, hopefully we're only submitting things that we're going to be happy having printed. But like I said, I back in the days when you actually put them in an envelope, I mailed one that in retrospect I wish I had misaddressed. So,
well, my question is more, if you are published, will they always let you know?
Well, and my response to that is they're only calling you if they're going to publish it.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. So yes, you would know.
Okay.
Now,
thank you.
If it's not a publication that's going to call you, then you're not going to know. My giant oops, I found out from a friend in the grocery store checkout line. So I guess there are not absolute guarantees about that.
Yeah, sometimes I've heard they don't notify and people see it, or a friend sees it. I do want to offer sometimes the DC office is here as a resource also. Some of our SPAs email our office just to ask, can we review their letter to the editor? How's the messaging? Especially if you're not clear. Feel free to take messaging from our website and know that we are here as a resource. So you can always contact me or Ari or anyone else in our office to take a look at it. As Nancy said, if there's, timing is something to consider. You don't want to take too long. So we understand if there isn't the time to send it our way, but know that we're a resource.
And the website is a tremendous resource of talking points, data, research, all sorts of great backup information too. So when you're writing in it, you don't want it to just be, here's what I think, but you want to support it with here's why. The website is a terrific source of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and feel free to plagiarize from our website. I can't, I'm sure they're just...
That's what it's there for, sure.
That's what it's there for. Take lines from our action alerts, our press statements, the information on the website, and use it for your efforts.
Okay, I think we're ready for our next slide.
My screen froze, but I'll get there.
Okay, and these are just some of the things that I've found make publications more likely to actually go forward with printing your submissions. The first one that's the second one on the list, but a really primary one, more and more and more, is a quick response. The news cycle has just become so speeded up that's just really, really critical. Newspapers also really appreciate a localized angle, how federal policies are impacting what's going on right in your area, and then certainly state and local policies as well. On the call this afternoon, one of the participants from New Orleans was working on a letter about immigration and the DACA young people. And she had already gotten numbers of how many young people in the state of Louisiana would be impacted by that. So she had personalized it or localized it in that way. And then right then and there on the call, Lindsay shared that some of her colleagues in the Washington office had been arrested this morning at a rally in support of DACA, and which then gave her another way to personalize this letter in New Orleans by saying, we're part of this national organization. This is how strongly our staff in Washington feels about it. We feel just as strongly. Here's why. So it was just fun to see that, the synergy of how all of that came together. In your materials when you registered for the class, there were, I believe the file was called LTEs 2, or Letters to the Editor 2, that included some examples of letters that some of them I've done, others of them were from other people, but that I thought were really good examples of some of these. So, for example, when we talk about looking for a fresh perspective or a fresh angle on an issue that you want to write about, there's one in your materials called Protests Stop Traffic. And as you may remember, I wish I would think that you don't, but I'm sure you do, St. Louis was the site of massive, massive racial protests after a police officer shot an unarmed young black man named Michael Brown about 3 years ago. And part of that protest involved protesters standing on the interstate highway and stopping traffic. And someone wrote in and said that those people aren't getting anywhere with those protests. They're just inconveniencing people and making them angry. And the response letter said, gosh, you know, it's unfortunate that you were inconvenienced, but think about the inconveniences that our African-American neighbors have to live with all the time. And it itemized about half a dozen different specific situations that sort of flipped the discussion in a new direction. So that's one good example of finding a different perspective. Another thing that increases your chances of getting published is if your letter includes some sort of new information about the topic. My example for that one is in that same handout. It talks about restrictive photo voter ID, which was a big issue here in the previous election. And right before the election, there was a lot of news about some absentee ballots being handled in a suspicious way. And someone wrote a letter to the paper and said, see, that proves that we need this voter ID bill. Well, photo voter ID is only relevant for people who are in person voting at the polls. And so those two things don't correspond in any way. And the letter then goes on to explain all the reasons that this photo ID is irrelevant. So it was countering the relationship that individual had made, and then itemizing all the information about why that isn't valid. Editors also really appreciate it when your submissions maintain a positive tone. And as you've probably already guessed, my first drafts are not always as positive as they might be. I am a little bit prone to four-letter words and a bit of fist shaking, but then you can go back and tone it down, be a little more positive. My example for that one is a letter about cutting off SNAP benefits to needy families. And someone had written in and talked about, those lazy people who are just freeloading off the rest of us and whatever. And that was a perversion of the gospel message to care for other people. So in my final draft, I was no longer shaking my fist. I was saying that I was deeply saddened to read this man's views, and that perhaps he wasn't aware of just how difficult those people's circumstances could be. I'm sure he individually didn't miss the fact that I really wanted to cut him off at the ankles. But from the perspective of someone who's going to publish it, it wasn't sort of the nasty kind of discourse that you see in the comment pages pretty often. And the last one is that the most effective letters include some sort of call to action. What is it that you want people to do after they read this letter? And my example for that was one about holiday help for a poor family. The newspaper had run a front page story about a disadvantaged couple that was stopped for a traffic violation and ended up getting thrown in jail, given these huge fines. When the reporter went to their home to talk to them, they had no furniture, they had no food, and a group of moms in one of our more affluent suburbs came forward with really wonderful support, furnishings, food, housewares, and it was really wonderful. But the letter makes the point that it's wonderful, wonderful to hear those stories. Now, what can you do after the holidays to change the set of circumstances that caused those people to be in those difficulties in the first place? And it itemized a bunch of options, and then closed with the line, advocating for systemic. I am always confused between systemic and systematic. Advocating for systemic change is the true path toward equal opportunity and dignity for all of our citizens. So a definite call to action. As you're creating a letter, next slide. As you're creating a letter, the really important thing to remember is that while you want to write in a way that's going to be persuasive to the people who read it, the absolutely critical first audience is the editor. So it makes sense to spend a little time talking about what are the things that editors seem to like. Now, just like women and Jewish people and African Americans, editors also are not one universally similar group. There are going to be differences, of course, from one editor to the next. But in general, the kinds of things that editors like sort of converge around a few topics. Number one, and again, looking at the editorial content and the letters that your publication tends to choose to print is going to give you some clues about this. But I've had pretty remarkable success getting letters published by following these guidelines. So I'll share them, and then you can look and see how much they seem to show up in the publications that you're looking at. But some sort of catchy opener, something that's a little provocative or a little surprising that draws a reader into the content is one thing that seems to do well. Including some sort of supportive evidence of the point that you're making. So it's not just, this is what I think, or I'm ticked off about thus and such, but really has a little bit of meat to it to support your assertion. I love this term, Oprah-size. I heard that term in one of the workshops I took at the last convention. And the presenter talked about Oprah-sizing your issue, meaning to give it a human story. So, for instance, in the letter about the protesters shutting down the interstate highway and causing people inconvenience, it refers very specifically to a PhD educator, an African-American woman, who every single time she visited her colleague in the white suburbs was stopped by the local police for driving while black every single time. And I think that was a great way to put a personal face on the idea of people being inconvenienced. So that's one example of Oprah-sizing. When I have the word mainstream on this slide with little quotation marks around it, this was another great tip that I got from a session at the convention. The presenter, every time she wanted to talk about the NCJW viewpoint as contrasted with more ultra-conservative or right-wing viewpoints, rather than using any terminology like progressive or liberal or left, she consistently used the term mainstream viewpoints, mainstream approaches, to sort of imply without flat out saying it that those opposing voices on the right were not part of the mainstream. So a really interesting use of language, I thought. Goes without saying that before you submit something, you want to be sure that your spelling and your grammar and your details are all absolutely letter perfect. And fortunately, we have easy programs built into our word processing software to double check most of those things. Another one that's not only effective, but I personally think really fun to use is various literary devices. Remember that editors are usually also writers, and so they're sort of writing geeks or language geeks or word geeks. And so examples of literary devices would be things like similes, where you say this is like this other thing. Little puns and plays on words. Alliteration, where you're using a lot of words that start with the same letter. You don't want to do any of those to the extent that they feel gimmicky, but done right, they really, really can draw people into your writing. Again, some examples from the handouts. That one about holiday helpers. The family's name happened to be Furlow, F-U-R-L-O-W. So the writer said it was encouraging to read about help for the Furlow family after their financial problems made front page news, and generous individuals produced food, furniture, and financial opportunities for the family. And you hear how all those F words just kind of draw you orally and visually right through the text to cause you to actually keep on reading it. I also like the starting sentence where the writer says, it was both heartwarming and disheartening to read about this. Again, just that repetition that makes it a little more interesting to hear it. And then the last thing on that list was just the phrase tight writing. And what that means is learning to write without any extraneous words that you really don't need to get your message across. And I always love to do this with my own writing. I love even more to do it with other people's writing because I'm not as invested in theirs as I am in my own. But what it means is looking at how something is worded and saying, what words could I slice out of this without really minimizing or detracting from the meaning. So again, I've given you a handout in your class materials, but we have it on the screen right now. This is taken from a really terrific blog post. It's credited lower on the page, so but we don't need to skim down for that right now, about how white people can be effective allies for our African American friends and neighbors. So what you're seeing on your screen right now is the original version of it. And what I'd like for us to do is ask you to look at that, just focus on the first little paragraph, the first 3 sentences, and see what words or phrases you might be able to eliminate, or how you might scramble that around a little to say the very same message in fewer words. And the reason that's so important is that we're bombarded by so much information that I suspect that you're feeling like I do, and like the people who study this sort of thing tell us that everybody today seems to feel, that our attention span is just shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. So the more we can consolidate our message, the more likely it is to be read. So now this is the part where I ask a question and you guys come back with responses on how we could make that first paragraph tighter writing. What can you see that you might be able to leave out or reword in some way? And I'll just give you time to look at that and come up with some ideas. I wish I had Jeopardy music to play in the background. Jane, do you have that where you can see it?
So does anyone have any ideas on how it could be shortened?
I mean, I would get rid of the whole beginning. The first thing we have to do is make it clear, and just start with racism, discrimination, and intolerance that maybe are not values that we tolerate, something like that. But at least for the beginning of the sentence, I would just get rid of that.
That's great. When I doctored this up, I chopped off the first thing we have to do is, and started with make it clear. But yeah, you're right. You don't even really need that. You could just start at racism. Bravo. We're going to have this down to 7 words before we're done.
Also, you don't need the word will before value. No longer. And
Yep.
you also they're repeating the word value twice, so you have to do something there.
Yep. Yeah, you're good at this game.
Yeah.
So now look at the second sentence. What could you do with that one?
So this is Lindsay. I don't fully agree with this sentence, so I would have to reword it. I don't think making anyone marginalized is the right approach, but I think we, saying something about like that means confronting other white people when they behave in ways that do harm. Or something like that.
And I questioned the need for that means and just wondered if we could start with make it a directive sentence and say, confront other white people.
And
Yeah,
make
I was
them
thinking
feel.
that too.
Or
That way the tense
right.
message is the
If,
sentence
if you want to keep making them feel marginalized, then we'll take off the ing. And if you want to take Lindsay's approach and not attempt to marginalize them, which is much nicer and which I didn't do either, then you could leave out that phrase and still say confront other white people when they behave in ways that do harm. And similarly, in that last sentence, you could leave off the you have to and make it a directive that starts with stands up.
Right.
Up.
I don't know if you stand up against or you stand up to.
Yes, I completely agree with that one. And we won't spend time to do the other two paragraphs now, but further down on that sheet, you'll see my original stab at chopping out words. And after the session this morning, I was able to chop out about 10 or 11 more. And now we just saved even more. So it'll be really interesting to see how tightly you can rewrite this to say the exact same message, but in a more concise, less wordy way. When I took let me see if I can find those numbers here, but I took the entire original blog post, which was 2,000 and something words, and just using the kinds of structures that we've just been working with, reduced it almost in half. So there's almost an epidemic of all these excess words out there, and it's great practice to learn how not to do that. So thanks for playing. I don't have a consolation prize for you, but hopefully there was a little bit of learning going on there. And then I just want to spend a few minutes on, real quickly, what to do with this after it's published. Number one recommendation is, oh my gosh, do not go online and read the online comments, because some sort of snakes crawl out from under rocks sometimes to comment online. On the other hand, when I read a letter to the editor that I really like and appreciate, then I never fail to go online and say that in the comments to give them a little bit of positive feedback. Don't miss the opportunity to share that published letter on social media. You can link to it, you can reprint it. You can do that individually, and we can do that as sections to broaden the reach of our message. You can certainly make photocopies of the actual printed letter and mail those to people like the lawmakers that you want to influence, to your members, to your supporters, to your funders, and also look for opportunities to acknowledge, maybe in your section newsletter, members of your group who have had things printed, because that not only validates them and gives them a little gold star, but I think it also really encourages other people to realize that this is something that they can also do to help get all of our messages out more broadly. So that is what I have. I want to leave you with a quick little reminder that basically advocacy is just a series of small, everyday activities. And we in St. Louis believe in that so strongly that we have created these absolutely fabulous insulated tumblers for hot and cold beverages in NCJW green and navy blue that have that quote on them. And we are hoping that we will see all of you in St. Louis in June for the leadership conference, at which time you will have the opportunity to take home one of those wonderful tumblers to remind yourself of that message every day.
Yeah.
Thank you Thanks very much for being with us. If you have other questions or comments that you want to share, I'm happy to stick around for a few more minutes. And as you are doing letters and having them published, I would love to see copies of them. Questions at all?
Let me just do a huge thank you to Nancy for leading us through this fantastic conversation and training on letters to the editor, and to you all for joining us in your evening. Before I end the recording, just quick reminder, and then we'll stick around if there are questions. February 20th, it's the third Wednesday of February, is our February series, our webinar. It's going to be on answering difficult questions, whether they be in NCJW meetings, coalition meetings, a one-on-one with someone, or a lobby visit. And then the March series is going to be the 21st, and it'll be with our legislative team probably on how to, best practices on lobbying. And as Nancy said, June 1st to 3rd is our leadership retreat, where there will be more training opportunities, and we're excited to see many of you there.